In the last video, we told the story of the Red Command, how it was born inside a prison, how it grew through the cocaine boom of the 1980s, and how it became one of the most powerful criminal organizations in South America. If you haven't watched that one yet, I highly recommend going back to it after this, but today we're zooming out, because the Red Command is just one piece of a much larger, much more disturbing picture. Today we're talking about Rio de Janeiro as a whole, about a city of over 6 million people, one of the most iconic, most photographed, most romanticized cities on the planet, that has been quietly divided into invisible territories, each controlled by a different armed group, each operating under its own rules, its own taxes, its own version of justice. Rio de Janeiro is not controlled only by the state. There are entire neighborhoods where official law simply does not exist. And the most unsettling part? This didn't happen overnight. To understand what Rio looks like today, you have to go back. Not to a single event, not to a single decision. You have to go back to the way the city was built, or more accurately, the way it wasn't built. Rio de Janeiro grew fast, faster than any government could or was willing to manage. Beginning in the mid-20th century, waves of people from Brazil's poorer regions flooded into the city looking for work, for opportunity, for something better. What they found instead was a city that had no room for them in its official plans. No housing, no infrastructure, no services. So they built their own. The favelas, the hillside and lowland communities that now cover significant portions of Rio, were never planned. They were improvised, built on land that nobody officially owned, in areas that the state largely chose to ignore. And when you ignore a place long enough, something else fills that space. The prison system made things significantly worse. Following Brazil's military dictatorship, which ended in the mid-1980s, correctional facilities became something nobody had intended them to be: schools. Not schools of rehabilitation, schools of criminal organization. Political prisoners and common criminals locked together inside places like the Candido Mendes facility on Ilha Grande formed alliances out of necessity. Those alliances didn't dissolve when people were released. They followed their members back into the streets of Rio. This is something we explored in depth in the last video. But the key idea to carry forward is this: crime doesn't appear out of nowhere. It occupies empty spaces. And Rio had more empty spaces than most people realize. By the time the 1980s cocaine boom reached Brazil, the foundations were already in place. What had started as loose prison alliances transformed into something far more structured, far more dangerous. The Red Command, the Comando Vermelho, was first. Born in the late 1970s, fully operational by the mid-1980s, controlling favelas across the northern zone of Rio by the end of the decade. We told that story already, but they weren't alone for long. The Friends of Friends, known in Brazil as the ADA, or Amigos dos Amigos, emerged in the late 1990s, formed by former Red Command members who had been expelled from the organization following an internal killing. Their stronghold was the Rocinha favela, the largest favela in the entire metropolitan region, home to tens of thousands of people, located in the South Zone, just minutes from some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the country. For years, the ADA operated under a particularly strategic model. Their most prominent leader, Antonio Bonfim Lopes, known widely as Nem da Rocinha, chose corruption over confrontation. Under his control, Rocinha experienced a period of relative calm, not because crime disappeared, but because it became organized, calculated, almost invisible. Nem reportedly financed political candidates, funded community events, provided basic services to residents. He wasn't just a criminal leader. He was, in the eyes of many residents, a governing authority. He was arrested in 2011, but many believe he continued directing the organization's operations from inside prison. Then there is the Third Pure Command, the Terceiro Comando Puro, or TCP. Originally a splinter faction of the Red Command, it was restructured in 2002 under new leadership and has since established firm control over large portions of Rio's northern and western zones. In recent years, intelligence reports have suggested a possible alliance between the TCP and the First Capital Command, the PCC, which is the largest criminal organization in all of Brazil, based in São Paulo. If that alliance is as strong as suspected, the implications for Rio's already fragile balance of power are significant. What's important to understand about these three groups is that they are not disorganized street gangs. They have hierarchies, they have territories with defined boundaries, they have financial structures. They control not just the drug trade, but the social fabric of entire communities. Who can enter, who can leave, what businesses can operate, what rules residents must follow. It evolved from street-level crime into something that more closely resembles a military and economic structure. Here is something that most tourists visiting Rio de Janeiro do not know, and that most Brazilians outside the city prefer not to think about. The city is divided. Not officially, not on any map you can download, not according to any government document, but the division is real, and everyone who lives there knows it. The southern zone, Ipanema, Copacabana, the beaches that appear on postcards, is relatively stable, heavily policed, visible to the outside world. The northern zone is densely populated and has historically been the primary battleground for drug trafficking factions. The western zone, newer and more rural, is where the militias, which we'll get to shortly, have established their strongest hold. But it's not a clean three-way split. Within each zone, within individual neighborhoods, the boundaries shift. A single street can mark the line between territory controlled by the Red Command and territory controlled by the TCP. Cross it without knowing, and the consequences can be severe. Residents don't just learn these boundaries, they live by them. Which bus stop is safe? Which shortcut is off limits? Which color clothing might be misread as an affiliation? This is what some researchers have called the phenomenon of invisible borders. The city has one official geography and an entirely different real geography. And for the people who live inside those borders every day, the real one is the only one that matters. If the drug factions represent one kind of parallel power in Rio, the militias represent something even more troubling, because they didn't emerge from the margins of society. They emerged from within the state itself. The Brazilian militias that control large portions of Western Rio are composed primarily of active and retired police officers, prison guards, and military personnel. They began appearing in the early 2000s, initially presenting themselves as an alternative to drug faction control. Their message to communities was straightforward: we will protect you, we will keep the traffickers out, we are the lesser evil. And for a time, some residents believed them. Compared to open gun battles between drug factions and police, the militia presence initially felt like stability. There were fewer shootings. There was a kind of order. Not the order of the state, but order nonetheless. Then the exploitation began. Residents under militia control discovered that the protection came at a price, and not a small one. Militias began charging monthly fees. They took over the distribution of cooking gas in their territories, forcing residents to buy exclusively from militia-controlled suppliers at inflated prices. They controlled access to cable television, to internet service, to land itself. Entire housing developments in the western zone were built on land the militias controlled, sold to families who had no idea they were buying property inside a criminal territory. The militias were no longer protectors. They were landlords, utility companies, and tax collectors, all rolled into one armed organization with no accountability to anyone. And unlike the drug factions, which at least had visible enemies and operated in a recognizable criminal framework, the militias built connections directly into legitimate political structures. Investigations over the years revealed that militia leaders funded political campaigns, placed their members in local government positions, and cultivated relationships with politicians at various levels. The former President Jair Bolsonaro himself was associated with figures connected to militia networks, an association that generated enormous controversy and multiple ongoing investigations in Brazil. More recently, some militia groups have made a significant strategic shift. They've begun allowing drug trafficking in their territories or conducting it themselves. The ideological separation that once gave them their public legitimacy has eroded. Today, in some parts of Rio, militias and drug factions have formed alliances, something that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. The boundaries between these categories of organized crime are blurring. At this point in the story, it's important to stop and reframe what we're actually talking about. This is not just crime. It stopped being just crime a long time ago. What exists in Rio de Janeiro today is a parallel system. Parallel government, parallel economy, parallel justice. In territories controlled by organized groups, whether drug factions or militias, residents live under a different set of rules than the rest of Brazil. Those rules are not written down. They are communicated through reputation, through fear, through example. In communities controlled by drug factions, there are typically informal curfews. There are rules about noise, about strangers, about what can and cannot be discussed with outsiders. Businesses pay informal taxes to the controlling group. Disputes are settled not by courts, but by whoever holds the weapon. Children grow up watching this system function every day, and for many of them, it becomes the only model of authority they know. In militia-controlled areas, the system is economically suffocating. Families living in the Western Zone have described paying monthly fees for protection, for gas, for internet, for water. Not to the government, not to registered companies. To men with guns who knocked on the door and made it clear that non-payment was not an option. One notorious example involved residents of the Morro do Fubá community being required to pay monthly fees equivalent to roughly 50 Brazilian reais as part of what was described as a protection scheme. The money generated by these systems is substantial. It funds weapons, vehicles, legal representation, political campaigns. It is laundered through construction companies, through real estate, through legitimate businesses in militia and faction territories. The criminal economy of Rio is not separate from the legal economy. It is woven into it at every level. The Brazilian government has not been passive. That much should be said clearly. Over the decades, there have been serious, sometimes extraordinary efforts to reclaim Rio's communities. The most significant was the Pacifying Police Unit program, known by its Portuguese initials UPP. Launched in 2009, the UPP placed permanent police units inside favelas, beginning with the Santa Marta community. The concept was community policing, officers living in the neighborhood, building relationships with residents, making themselves a permanent, visible presence rather than an occasional invasion force. 32 units were eventually established across Rio. In its early years, the program showed measurable results. Visible criminal activity declined. Residents reported feeling safer. The UPP became an internationally discussed model for urban security. This was particularly important for Brazil, which was preparing to host the 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Summer Olympics, events that would put Rio under extraordinary global scrutiny. But the program had fatal weaknesses. The first was training. Officers assigned to UPP units were not always adequately prepared for the complexity of the communities they were entering. Abuses occurred. The most infamous involved a man named Amarildo Souza, a 42-year-old construction worker from Rocinha, who was taken in for questioning by UPP officers on a morning in 2013 and never came home. His disappearance sparked massive public protests. An investigation eventually led to the indictment of 24 officers. 12 were ultimately convicted of torture, evidence tampering, and concealment of a body. Amarildo's case destroyed whatever trust had been carefully built between UPP officers and favela residents. It confirmed what many already feared, that even the program designed to protect them could become another source of danger. The second weakness was funding. The UPP was an expensive, long-term commitment, and Brazilian governments, facing economic crisis and shifting political priorities, pulled back financial support. Without resources, without personnel, without the sustained political will to maintain pressure, the program collapsed. And when the UPP collapsed, the factions moved back in. The cycle is almost too painful to watch. State enters, state weakens, criminal organizations reclaim ground. The human cost is paid, as always, by the people who live there, people who had no say in who entered or left their community, who simply wanted to raise their families without hearing gunshots. October 28, 2025, brought another significant chapter. A large-scale police operation was launched across the Penha and Alemão complexes, areas long associated with Red Command control, under what authorities called Operation Containment. It was described as the most lethal police operation in the history of Rio de Janeiro state, with over 135 assault rifles seized. It surpassed in scale even the notorious Jacarezinho operation of 2021. The state entered again with enormous force, but history gives us little reason to believe the story ends there. None of this is abstract. None of it is distant. There are human beings inside every one of these statistics. A child growing up in a favela controlled by a drug faction learns, before they learn most things taught in school, that certain streets are off limits. They learn which men carry weapons and which don't. They learn to keep quiet about what they see. Some of them, with no other option visible, are recruited into those same organizations before they reach adulthood. The use of child soldiers by both drug factions and militias has been documented by Brazilian human rights investigators. Children as young as 12 or 13 have been found carrying weapons, running messages, serving as lookouts. Women in militia territories have described being unable to leave their communities without permission, not formal permission, not written anywhere, but the kind of permission you understand without being told, the kind where you know what happens if you don't ask first. Elderly residents have watched their neighborhoods transform over decades. People who remember when their favela was simply a community of working people, before the drug economy arrived, before the militias, before the helicopters and the rifles, and the invisible borders. Many residents live in a permanent state of cognitive contradiction. They may know the names of the men who control their neighborhood. They may have watched those men give out food during the holiday season, sponsor children's birthday parties, pay for a neighbor's funeral. They may also have watched those same men order someone shot. When protection and oppression come from the same source, when the people who harm you are also the only people who sometimes help you, the moral geography becomes impossible to navigate cleanly. This is what the normalization of violence does. It doesn't make people comfortable with violence. It makes them exhausted by it, worn down by a situation they didn't create and cannot escape. That is the question underneath everything else. You've heard the history. You understand the structure. But why, after decades, after billions of reais spent on security operations, after international attention and domestic outrage, why does this continue? The honest answer is that there is no single reason. There is a constellation of reasons, each one reinforcing the others. Corruption is the most visible. Police officers on faction or militia payrolls, politicians whose campaigns are funded by criminal organizations, judges, prosecutors, city officials, all operating inside a system where the line between legal and illegal authority has been smudged beyond recognition. In 2007 and 2008 alone, 3 politicians were arrested for supporting armed militias. Investigations have connected militia networks to political figures at multiple levels of Brazilian government, including national ones. But corruption doesn't exist in a vacuum. It grows in the soil of inequality. Rio de Janeiro is one of the most unequal cities in an already unequal country. The wealthy neighborhoods of the South Zone exist within eyesight of communities where families lack running water. This isn't a metaphor. It is a literal geographic reality. Tourists photograph the beaches. They are often unaware of what is happening a few kilometers away, just out of frame. The prison system continues to serve as an organizational hub rather than a deterrent. Faction and militia leaders direct operations from behind bars. Incarceration without structural reform doesn't break criminal organizations. In the Brazilian context, it has historically strengthened them, giving leaders time and space to plan, recruit, and consolidate power. Public policy has been inconsistent, underfunded, and too often reactive. Programs like the UPP demonstrate that meaningful change is possible, and also that it requires a sustained, generational commitment that Brazilian governments have not been able or willing to maintain. And underneath all of it is a simpler, harder truth. For a significant number of people in Rio, criminal organizations offer something the state does not. They offer presence. They offer, however twisted, a form of order. In a neighborhood where the government has never reliably delivered basic services, where police have historically been seen as a source of danger rather than safety, where institutions are abstractions and the man on the corner with the rifle is a physical reality, loyalty and even affiliation can become rational choices. That does not make it acceptable, but it makes it understandable, and understanding it is the only path toward changing it. Rio de Janeiro was not taken over in a day. It was a slow process. Decades of neglect, of policy failure, of corruption, of poverty. Decades of human beings making desperate decisions inside systems that gave them very few good options. The city you see in photographs, the carnival, the beaches, the mountains dissolving into the ocean at sunset, is real. It is genuinely beautiful, but it exists alongside another Rio, one that does not appear in travel guides, one that millions of people navigate every single day. The question that haunts everyone who studies this, researchers, journalists, the people who live there, is not simply who controls Rio. It is whether control can ever be genuinely returned to its people, not through force alone, not through a single operation, however large, but through the patient, unglamorous, long-term work of building something real in the spaces that were left empty for too long. Whether that is still possible is a question Brazil has not yet answered. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, the best thing you can do right now is hit subscribe. This channel exists because of people who want to understand the world more honestly, not just the version that's easy to look at. And if you have thoughts on this case, on Rio, on what you think should happen, leave them below. I read every comment, and this is exactly the kind of conversation worth having.